Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Today I've got Kirk and Nicolas with me. And today we're discussing the role of Islam in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the two-state solution. This is on the back of some comments that were made by Mohsen Hass Mossab Hassan Youssef, I think I'm getting his name right, at the recent conference that was hosted by the Jerusalem Post, where he made a number of comments that were warning the people in Israel against the necessity of opposing Islam and its role in motivating the conflict and motivating terrorism against them, and also warning them that the two-state solution was inherently a solution to the conflict, which necessitated the destruction of Israel. So we're going to be talking about these issues, what we think about them, and perhaps some things in sort of broader context. So Nicolas, I'll come to you first. What did you make of his comments?
Well, let me give a little bit of Canadian context here. One of the things I think we're going to talk about later in the show is some of the European countries which have jumped on the bandwagon for recognizing a Palestinian state. I think it's only a matter of time before that happens here in Canada. There are at least two of our major parties in Canada, the Green Party and the New Democratic Party, which, if you know a little bit about Canadian politics, those are pretty far left-wing parties. They're already strongly calling for Canada's official recognition of a Palestinian state. To the best of my knowledge, Justin Trudeau has been hemming and hawing on the issue. He said that he does support a two-state solution, but he said he's willing to officially recognize Palestine when he thinks it's conducive to peace. As far as I know, our Conservative Party, which is our slightly right of center party, they haven't really quite weighed in any strong sort of way. So it's definitely the wind seems to be blowing in that direction. And now one of the things that came through most strongly from the article you mentioned and some other interviews that I've seen with him is that people in the West have no clue what's actually going on. People don't really have any sort of concrete idea what that would actually look like, a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. People don't know. No, frankly, I don't think people care what kind of a threat, what kind of an existential danger that would be for the state of Israel and for the people of Israel.
I was muted, sorry. And Kirk, what did you think?
What I found interesting was, yeah, he talks a lot about Islam, but then he doesn't really talk much about Hamas, which is, viewed more as the more explicit Islamic theocratic element that is at odds with Israel when talking about the context of who's representing the so-called Palestinian movement, Palestinian cause. But he emphasizes the Palestinian Liberation Organization much more, which is considered more secular. It's not based on theocracy. It's based more on Arab nationalism. And he focuses a lot more on their role in the history of war against Israel. And yeah, so that's what I found interesting. And yeah, I think there's something to be said that if Gaza is acknowledged as its own state, and either if it's represented by the PLO through the Palestinian Authority or through Hamas, um, not sure that's good for the Palestinian people. I mean, that's like the nicest thing you could say about them is like, even if they end in hostilities with Israel and recognize them as a legitimate state, which I'm not sure that either of them do at this point, but like a lot of the so-called pro-Palestine advocates, like this is the best you can do, some form of statism where even if they're not actively waging war with Israel, they're under the boots of either some form of nationalist dictatorship or some theocratic dictatorship. Kind of reminds me of Ayn Rand's essay Roots of War, where she talks about a lot of the peace advocates of their day. And what they really want, that what they're really bothered by is one nation aggressing against another. What they don't really seem bothered by, and I think this is pretty telling, is when a dictatorship is waging war against its defenseless, helpless citizens. So,
Mm. So let's focus in on, I guess, one aspect of what he's talking about, which was the role of Islam, because that's something, as Nicholas was kind of saying, if you look at his broader comments, that's something that he focuses in on a lot. And yet, I think for a lot of people talking about the conflict, Islam is almost a secondary issue, or maybe not even an issue at all. And speaking more broadly about how sort of Western leaders have approached Islam, in its role in kind of causing the troubles to the Western world in the last few decades. There's an enormous sort of evasiveness about it. I mean, just thinking about kind of Obama talking about ISIS and Islam is really the religion of peace. Even I think George Bush made similar comments after 9/11, right? And I think on the face of it, that should be rather confusing to people because when the Western world went to war with the Nazis, a few people would have said, "Oh, Nazism is kind of this fringe ideology. It's not really relevant. They're motivated more by culture or geopolitical issues and stuff like that." So there's something really strange about it. And I mean, Nicholas, one, do you agree that people are evasive about Islam's role in the conflict or in these kind of things? But why do you think that is? And I mean, and do you agree with Yusuf's focus on Islam in this?
Yeah, particularly since October, here in the Western media, North American media, there's been virtually no mention of Islam, hardly any mention of Hamas. And I think it's not difficult to see why, because any mention is not naturally going to bring up accusations of Islamophobia, which that's a very serious concern. It's something that Trudeau talks about a lot in his speeches. But so one problem that I did have with the article with Youssef is he talks about we have to fight Islam. He talks about the danger of the Islamic ideology, but the only way to fight any ideology, the only way to fight any system of bad ideas is with good ideas. And so what alternative does he offer to Islam? And it's difficult to see what that would look like even in the Middle East. Like let's suppose that there were a Palestinian state, and let's suppose Youssef talks about we have to get Hamas out of power. Okay, well then who would be in power? The PLO or the Palestinian Authority? And what would that look like from the point of view of, would that still be an Islamist theocratic state? Would that still be a state where women, minorities are oppressed? It's really hard to imagine what a solution would look like that would actually be good for Palestinian people.
Yes. To be fair, I think he does address a little bit about the Palestinian Authority, and I guess I don't keep up the tabs exactly on where the PLO kind of stands in its allegiance to kind of its Marxist-Leninist kind of ideology, but I think maybe they make more kind of allowance for Islam nowadays than they may have done in the past. Kirk, what do you think about this kind of role of Islam in all this?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I mean, what's I think is important is that when you have theocratic regimes like Hamas or like we saw like what has happened in Iran the last 40 years and in various parts of the Middle East, it's you have a statist militant group come to power and the population doesn't really have the moral clarity or confidence to oppose them because they all buy into the same religion. I think we've seen this in Afghanistan when the Taliban started to retake Afghanistan. What replaced the Taliban was essentially a later form of theocracy. Like, oh, okay, they had elections and elements of democracy and they were nicer to women, I guess. But then the Taliban comes back and they said, yeah, we're just taking your guys' basic fundamental premises and taking it to its logical extreme. And if you already buy into this religion, especially to an extreme extent, you don't really have the fortitude to really oppose groups like the Taliban morally or intellectually. I do want to go back to your point about the fact that like both the Obama administration and the Bush administration were kind of evasive on Islam's role in the war on terror and 9/11 and whatnot. And I think a lot of people might be confused like that because you have a Democrat and you have a Republican, liberal, conservative. And from what I can tell, they are evasive for different reasons. My guess with Obama is that his judgment is clouded by what is often called multiculturalism, which is this idea that one culture is not better than another, and we shouldn't be judging cultures. Who are you to decide that one culture is better than the other, or one set of ideas is better than the other? Whereas people like George W. Bush, who is a very devout Christian religious man, I think he's evasive because of the fact that to acknowledge that Islam may have had a role in motivating people to do horrible things, um, he might have to check some of his own premises. He might have to admit that religion, when taken to its extreme logical conclusion, motivates people to do horrible things, including terrorism and wanting to impose their set of ideas on other people.
Mm.
Yeah, and can I add something to that? So the question of how the West should respond to the threat of Islam, or what it would actually mean for the West to fight Islamic ideas, which is something else that came up in Yusef's article. Again, it gets back to my question that the only way to fight ideas is with better ideas. And so we had the example some months ago of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who said, Islam is a threat, wokeness is a threat. And how did she respond to that?
By
By
becoming a
converting to
Christian.
Christianity. And if that's the proposed solution, oh yeah, we have to fight Islam, so let's all convert to Christianity. That's no solution because ultimately the philosophical roots of all the major religions are ultimately the same. They all boil down to mysticism, irrationalism, collectivism.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting. Ayn Hirsi Ali's article where she announced that she was becoming a Christian was an interesting one. And partly I think it's kind of what you're talking about is not having really a better set of ideas to put in place. So therefore she kind of is just looking around to what is the kind of Western set of ideas. And she specifically, I think, emphasizes the sort of tradition and narrative. So therefore she kind of goes with Christianity. I think maybe also, and I don't want to be insulting, but there was a certain kind of shallowness amongst the new atheists who she's kind of associated with, where really the kind of issues, they don't really push all the way down to the most fundamental philosophical issues. So, if we're saying you need to kind of get a whole new kind of secular philosophy, I think there's a way in which they would find that sympathetic, but then also that clearly wasn't the first thing in Ayn Hirsi Ali's mind when it came to how do we oppose the role of Islam. And again, and so she flees into this, I guess, really what you'd have to say is a kind of tribalism and looking for, well, what is the Western tribes ideas and all this kind of stuff. But I think you made a good point. I mean, and this is what you were saying, Nicholas, about what do you replace it with? And I think for Yusef, I think, since he's come to the West and he's spoken against Hamas, I think he's actually converted to becoming a Christian. I'm not sure which denomination. I want to say maybe it was Catholicism, but I'm not exactly sure. So unfortunately, although I think there's lots of ways in which he's very good and he makes lots of kind of good statements in his, against Hamas and in his kind of fundamental understanding of the conflict and wanting to kind of shake people out of their stupor about, delusions about the Palestinian cause being cuddly and friendly. I think unfortunately his solution presumably would be that you introduce a kind of Catholic state, I guess, or Christian state. Presumably, I'd have to think so. But then I guess moving to his comments about the two-state solution, because the two-state solution is kind of, I think, what people in the West fall back on as a real solution to the conflict. No matter how much terrorism goes on, no matter how much of X, Y, and Z goes on, ultimately the two-state solution is what will, save us all and save the Palestinians, save the Israelis. And I want to hear what you think about his kind of attack on it, because I think there's some things which are good and some things which are maybe not exactly the right kind of focus, because he focuses a lot on kind of there is no such thing as Palestine, and he in a sense he does a good kind of deconstruction. Is Palestine a nation? Is it a language, a religion, and whatever? And that's right, because there is no literal state of Palestine, and to some extent it's a kind of artifice. But so, well, I'll leave it there. So, Nicholas, what did you think about his critique of the two-state solution, and what do you think about the two-state solution in principle?
Well, I know a lot of people here who pay lip service to the two-state solution. Again, the problem is that most people don't really have that concretized in their mind what exactly that would look like. And even just recently, I was looking at some articles here in North America promoting the idea of a two-state solution and some arguments that they present in favor of it. Well, it would encourage the more moderate elements among the Palestinians. It would give more scope for freedom and democracy, and the two states would be side by side peacefully. It's just so contrary to reality. Back in 2005, when the Palestinians had the opportunity to vote, they voted in Hamas. It's very clear what their choice, that they chose the most radical, the most anti-Semitic organization they could have possibly chosen. So I just don't see how the two-state solution benefits anyone. It certainly doesn't benefit Israel, who would be under constant threat of an attack from their immediate neighbors. But how it even benefits the Palestinians themselves to live under that kind of regime.
Yeah. Kirk, what do you think about the two-state solution and Yusuf's comments?
No, I think Nicholas is absolutely correct with his analysis. And, going back to the fact that it seems like the two main likelihoods of what their governance would manifest in. It'd either be a continuation of Hamas or the PLO, Islamic theocracy, or some nationalist-based statism. And it's like neither of these ideologies are conducive to freedom, conducive to happiness, conducive to wealth creation or progress. So you'd be sentencing the people in places like Gaza to just more misery. And on top of the fact, and that's just assuming that their representatives wouldn't be continually waging war with Israel. From what I can tell, both the PLO, I've heard that the Palestinian Authority, maybe one of you guys can correct me, I've heard that they've like over the years have like acknowledged that Israel has a right to exist or whatever, even though in their original covenant they say that like Zionism is this horrible force and that it's like an illegitimate, then they have like some sort of illegitimate claim to the land or whatever. And it's like, if that's their perspective, then yeah, long term, as Nicolas pointed out, this is going to just necessitate more hostilities toward Israel because fundamentally neither group recognizes Israel's right to exist as their neighbors.
Yeah, I believe that in the 90s, when Arafat was still around, I believe the PLO kind of recognized Israel. Now, I don't know what that really means because then it's not like their actions have done anything that would suggest that they recognize its legitimacy, its sovereignty, all those kind of things. And certainly Hamas
I would
doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also add it seems like their aggression and hostility toward Israel somewhat justifies the existence of both. Like it seems like both ideologies kind of have this hostility toward Israel baked in, like that's their whole purpose for existing, or at least one of them, as far as I can tell.
Mm. I think the other thing which underpins people's loyalty to the two-state solution, it's kind of two things. One, I think people are very wedded to the idea of national self-determination. And so if you have some kind of identifiable kind of ethnic group somewhere, they deserve a nation. They deserve to have, a state apparatus so that they can determine their own future or goal, is usually how it's put. And certainly I remember being at school and being taught about the Kurdish people and how it was, a tremendous tragedy that they didn't have a state of their own of Kurdistan and that they were being oppressed in Iraq and and all this kind of stuff. And I think this same thing very clearly applies to the Palestinians. And you see here the Palestinians uh, make this case for themselves. The guy in the UK who's the kind of quote unquote Palestinian ambassador, a guy called Hassam Zumlot, if I'm getting his name correctly, always speaks about how you're fine for self-determination, for the Brits, for the Irish and all that kind of stuff. But for the Palestinians, you don't want it. And so because people have bought into this idea of national self-determination for ethnic groups, although I think that's actually quite a troubled idea if you really dig into it, I think that leads to some of the support for the two-state solution because, okay, so the Jews have to have their state, the Palestinians have to have theirs. Let's not dig into that too much. And then also, because the dominant ethics is altruistic ethics, I think that puts a lot of emphasis onto compassion and empathy and those kind of things. And so people approach it in this sort of very emotional, kind of soggy bottom kind of way. So that if you can dress up the Palestinian kind of state as this kind of, well, just be compassionate towards them. They really want is to rule themselves and they're fighting for their own independence. And that kind of, you can conjure up a kind of Nelson Mandela kind of image behind it, which they literally do because they obviously bring up the idea of apartheid. I think that's why you see so much allegiance to the idea of a two-state solution, when actually I think it's been a failed solution for a very long time. And I think the whole instigation of it by the United Nations in 1947 really is just a concession to the kind of violence coming from the Arab sides against the Israelis or the nascent Israelis. And although that's understandable because you have a real problem, what do you do about this? I think it's flawed from the off because of that, and it's making too much of a concession towards that. Now, Nicolas, Rand has I can't think explicitly where she's speaking about national self-determination, but she does have a fair bit to say about, people having a right to a state. Does anyone have a right to a state? What are the conditions under which a state has the right to exist? Can you tell us a bit about Rand's thought on that?
Well, she does talk about this, particularly in two articles, Man's Right and the Nature of Government. And the central point here, which so many people in the West miss, is that the only foundation for legitimate statehood, legitimate governance, is individual rights. That's precisely what's missing in all of this discussion of a two-state solution, recognition of the Palestinian state, that all rights ultimately come down to individual rights, the rights of individual human beings. And we've said this many, many times on this channel that Israel is really the only country in this entire region which is semi-free, which has any recognition of rights at all, equal rights for men and women, for different ethnic groups, different national groups. Individual rights simply don't exist under any kind of Islamic theocratic regime. If you look at the other countries, if you look at Iran, if you look at Syria or whatever, they simply have no idea. And I think it stands to reason that a Palestinian state would have no conception of individual rights either.
Mm. I agree. And I think at best what you would have is some kind of, you'd maybe have some language of rights, but it'd be really kind of group rights, collectivized rights, rights of the Arab Palestinians, and certainly no rights for the Arab Israelis. Kirk, do you have any other thoughts about why people are so wedded to the two-state solution?
Not really. Yeah, just for me, I think it just goes back to this notion that, oh, if we just give them their own land and, this hogwash about self-determination or whatever, then they'll stop being hostile because, hey, they're given their own land, they're given their own country. And that's what they really want, even though that's not really what they want if you read their ideology and whatnot. But yeah, so no, and yeah, just I think this evasive nature of people seem fine when especially when they talk about ceasefire, like they want a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but they're not calling a ceasefire between Hamas and its constituents, or say the Islamic Republic and its constituents. And yeah, as we know, the Islamic Republic is responsible for a lot of what's going on in Israel these days, including with funding the Houthis and Hezbollah along with Hamas.
Mm. I guess part of the wider context of this story was the recent recognition, or symbolic recognition from 3 European states of Palestine, of a Palestinian state. And Nicolas, you mentioned that just at the beginning. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's 4 states now, isn't it? It was Spain, Norway, Ireland, and most recently Slovenia, if I'm not mistaken.
Really, I hadn't seen that. Okay, 4 states.
I think so. I think there are more states that are considering it. I think I've heard that Czechia, Hungary, and some other states. I think we're going to see a domino effect in the weeks to come. That more and more states are going to get on the bandwagon.
Mm. And do you think they're motivated by the same things we've been speaking about, national self-determination? Because certainly with Ireland, I always think that there's a role of kind of post-colonialism here, that kind of the way people dress up the Palestinians is that these are people who are, colonized throughout history, particularly colonized by the British, most recently the Mandate for Palestine. And then with the creation of Israel, which they then dress up as a colonial entity anyway, really, what you get is that just further neo-colonialism into the modern day, the encroachments into the West Bank that are made by Israel because of various terrorist threats. These are actually just motivated by the desire to dominate. So what do you view as the motivation of these European states in recognizing Palestine?
Well, I think definitely post-colonialism is a strong motivation. I can't speak so much for the European context, but certainly all the discussions here, particularly in Canada, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years of post-colonialism in terms of the way Native people were treated with the residential school system, and even the whole sort of national hand-wringing and self-flagellation with the fact that the Europeans dared to come to this continent and take it over from the native people who were here for thousands and thousands of years. So I think a lot of the sympathy here for the Palestinian cause is closely connected with the kind of sympathy that we have for the plight of the native people, or calls for native people to have some kind of autonomy or sovereignty.
Yeah. And well, that's interesting. So then in Canada, then I obviously don't know that context. Is there a lot of support for Palestine then, or is it more
Oh,
mixed?
yes. I mean, so in the past few weeks, we've had our share of the campus protest. I just heard in the news that there was here in Vancouver, there was a major intersection near the University of British Columbia that was blocked for several hours because some students were protesting on behalf of Palestine. And if you consider what these students have been taught for years and for decades about oppression, about colonialism, about the evils of capitalism and the evils of the West. It's not at all surprising that they're all en masse jumping on the Palestinian bandwagon.
Mm. And well, and just to stick with that, so I've only been to Canada once, but I went to Vancouver and I was speaking with people, and although there did seem to be a large kind of national guilt about the about the when Canada was initially colonized and the treatment of the indigenous peoples, there seemed to be a lot of dissatisfaction and resentment about I guess the way the current government is trying to deal with the kind of special exemptions that are made for the various indigenous groups and so on. So is there a bit of a shift in that in Canada, or is it do you view it as mostly staying the same?
I think there's still a lot of resentment towards the preferential treatment on the part of the government. Something that's been happening in the past few months. I think I remember I even did a discussion with James Valiant on this some months ago. Is universities are offering free tuition to people who of native descent, of Aboriginal Canadian descent, or they're getting scholarships. I think there's a lot of resentment, but the resentment is going underground. People, because of the current climate, the current political climate, people are afraid to speak up on these issues for fear of being seen as bigoted or whatever. So the loudest voices in the culture are very much the anti-colonial voices, the pro-Aboriginal voices, and consequently now the pro-Palestinian voices.
Mm. That's interesting. Just when I went to Canada, I guess what I was struck by, the resentment was even coming from people who I think kind of, weren't explicitly political, but kind of tended towards the left. So I was just wondering whether that kind of had sort of developed over time. Kirk, what do you think about the European nations? Are we just do we just have our heads in the sand? Are we just kind of driven by a death wish? What motivates so many nations in Europe to support a two-state solution, to support the Palestinian cause?
Yeah, it sounds like what you guys have been saying. It's a lot of this guilt over, the history of what's called colonialism. And it looks like it might get worse. I'm hearing that in the UK, the upcoming elections, the Labour Party is expected to make huge gains. I'm reading that this new president of Mexico, I guess, is like said that Palestine deserves a state or whatever. So to Nick's point earlier, I think we might see more dominoes start to fall soon.
Yeah, certainly in Europe, there's a tremendous amount of guilt. The only kind of state which is resolutely sort of pro-Israel, and maybe this is even motivated by a bit of guilt as well, is Germany. And I mean, you see a lot of good stuff from Germany on Israel and Palestine, but unfortunately, most European nations are really quite terrible on it. But okay, so let's move to our second topic then. So I believe this is talking about the kind of protests which are going on in Israel at the moment. Did you guys have a chance to look at those articles and have any thoughts?
Well, I was
Nicolas?
mainly focusing. Actually, I did have one more comment about the first article, if I may,
Sure.
about Youssef's interview. One thing that he said that was interesting, which resonates with something that's going on here. He said, and I don't know if he was being a little bit facetious or if he was, but he was saying something about Holocaust, mandatory Holocaust education throughout the Middle East. Do you remember reading that sort of
Yeah.
sentence? If you blinked, you missed it, but it was definitely there. That definitely jumped out at me because it was only a few weeks ago that I was watching TV and somebody on the news was talking about the campus protests. And I think this was somebody possibly associated with the Jewish Anti-Defamation League or some sort of philo-Semitic or pro-Israel organization. And this woman was saying, yeah, we need to have mandatory Holocaust education in all the Canadian schools. And now this is starting to happen. As far as I know, it's been adopted in Ontario. I think British Columbia is strongly considering, if they haven't already, strongly considering adopting mandatory Holocaust education. There are a few other Canadian provinces where this idea is being floated. Well, that's a brilliant idea. All we need is the government to step in and tell us what we have to learn, and that always solves every problem, right?
I suppose so. Um, I mean, so do you think though, in a kind of narrower sense, given that I guess if we're talking about in the Middle East, which I think he was talking about in a Middle East context, right? If the kind of mandatory Holocaust education.
Yeah.
Given that the state is so much involved in education anyway, I would have to think, and certainly if we're talking about in the Palestinian territories, if in the West Bank, in Gaza, even up in Syria and in Jordan, so much of the education is run through UNRWA, which is I guess isn't strictly a governmental organization, but it's, it's from the UN, so it's this kind of supranational organization. Do you think that, okay, maybe long term the government needs to get out of education, but do you think there could be a greater value? And because we know, for example, just how much of the education there is kind of debauched with anti-Semitism and with all this kind of stuff. And presumably, if they are taught about the Holocaust, they're taught to celebrate it. But do you think, because I think there could be some value in if these people are taught about the Holocaust, but they're taught about it from a different perspective, and they're fully educated on it, there could be some value there. Do you think?
Can you imagine what Holocaust education would look like in most Middle Eastern countries? I mean, an actual sort of philo-Semitic interpretation of Holocaust education. Could you imagine something like that happening in Iran or Saudi Arabia? Is that even conceivable within the next generation or two? I don't even see how that would be possible.
Mm, sure. Kirk, what do you think about mandatory Holocaust education?
I mean, to Nick's point, I think Iran has a history of presidents who have like loudly denied the Holocaust or downplayed it or whatever. And yeah, I'm not sure that's going to really solve anything because you even see in today's commentary about the issue, people like to throw out around the G word. They like to accuse Israel of the G word. I'm sure many people know what I'm talking about. They like to say that they're committing a genocide with Gaza, with the way they're handling things in Gaza. And I think people, you could say they use the fact that the Holocaust happened, and then they'll say that Israel's basically doing the same thing, and that's used as an excuse to then talk about two-state solutions and telling Israel that they need to just tolerate hostile enemies living next door to them, and even if they're firing rockets indiscriminately every day and loudly calling for the destruction of Israel, but then Israel's the one that's accused of the G word. So I'm not sure if that's I'm all for people learning about the Holocaust. It's a topic I've tried to take seriously even as of late. Not so much that, whether or not the Holocaust happened, but like what led to it. Like what was the attitude amongst everyday Germans that led them to being tolerant of an Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime to the point where they were just slaughtering millions of people and starting all these wars. So I'm all for people learning more about it, but I'm not sure if this is a band-aid for what's going on in the Middle East right now.
I'm
Yeah.
seeing an interesting trend in the way people are throwing the word genocide around so carelessly. And we've seen this before. We've seen, for example, in recent years, the word racist was thrown around as an epithet all over the place, particularly with the Black Lives Matter protests and the George Floyd case and so on. And I'm starting to see that happening more and more with genocide. Now everything is genocide. Here, let me give you a very quick quiz. What do the following have in common? The Catholic Church, the United Nations, and the Government of Canada. What do those three have in common? Well, all three of those bodies declared that Canada is guilty of genocide against its native people through colonization of North America, the residential school system. Yeah, you remember there was that case in the news, I think it was 3 years ago, where supposedly an unmarked grave was found in Kamloops containing the bodies of it was 215 native children. Notice the specificity of that number. It was using ground penetrating radar. Within a couple of days, all the international media were saying, "Oh, Canada is guilty of genocide," and one of the leaders of our major political parties went on TV and made a tearful speech saying, "This happened here. It wasn't some third world country." I mean, right now, it doesn't take very much to be accused of genocide. You don't need facts, you don't need evidence, you don't need reason, you don't need reality. It's just become an all-purpose term of abuse. The same way that feminists have been calling all men sexist, and the way that certain types have been saying that all white people are racist or white supremacists. Genocide is just a term that's being hurled around with no regard for facts and reality.
Yeah, I certainly think you're right about this. Saw from Greg Salmieri just a few weeks ago, which was talking about this. And he was saying that if any war could be accurately compared in all the actions that are being taken to the kind of action that was taken by the Allied forces in the Second World War, and you're calling it a genocide, or someone is calling it a genocide, then that person is not really trying to make an accurate description of what's going on in the current war. They're just trying to smear a war or military action that they don't like. And I think that's very true. And if people think even about kind of massacres that have occurred in history, and well, let me couch it this way. Rand has a lot to say about, how people develop concepts and when people develop concepts and so on and so forth. And certainly she thinks they kind of develop concepts in a very particular way, and they develop them particularly when they need them. And for all of history, we didn't have, despite the awful warfare that had happened and the awful massacres that had happened, we didn't have the idea of genocide until after the Second World War. So genocide is a very particular kind of mass killing that doesn't resemble a lot of even some of the slaughters that had happened in history, although some things retrospectively were labeled as genocides, like the Armenian genocide. So just to casually kind of throw around the term as if any military action constitutes a genocide is just mere foolishness. And I think Greg is right in saying that the people who are doing it, just want to smear the Israeli military because they're engaged in a war against the Palestinians, and these people who are using the term genocide believe in the Palestinian cause, right? So it's I want to call it sophistry, but maybe that's even too much of a dignification.
Well, I'm sure lots of innocent German children died during the bombing of Dresden and so on. I'm sure lots of innocent Japanese children died in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was that it? Were those actions genocide? I'm sure probably our contemporary college snowflakes would say so, but in reality, I don't see how that works.
No, I don't think so either. And certainly whenever I bring up the bombing of Dresden, people accuse me of being defensive for being British. But yeah.
Another concept that's often thrown around is a concept of war crime. And so if they wouldn't call it a genocide, they might call it a war crime. And I've definitely seen people try to call both the bombing of Dresden in World War II and the atomic bombings on Japan war crimes as an attempt to smear the UK and the United States for, trying to defend themselves.
Yeah. So particularly the bombing of Dresden and the dropping of the nuclear bombs are something that I think has been a kind of article of faith on the left for a number of decades now, where these are actually real crimes that have gone kind of unaddressed in the Western world because, there's all the World War II propaganda, and that has a legacy to today. So we don't want to address the really bad things we did in the war. But I'm suspicious really of the whole idea really of a war crime. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that, because in a sense, my first kind of gut reaction to it is that war itself is a crime by the instigating nation, by the aggressing nation. And so, although I think that certainly things could be done in war which are immoral, we're almost in a kind of context where law and order, is suspended. So talking about a crime in that context seems a bit weird. Do you guys agree with that, or do you think there maybe are things which can be considered a war crime?
Yeah, you're quite right. I think James Valiant has made this point quite eloquently in the past that a war is a breakdown of civilization. War is a breakdown of law and order and communication and reason and rights. And of course, the moral blame for a war is with an aggressor, with the aggressor nation, whether that's the Imperial Japanese Army or the Nazis or Hamas or whatever. But yeah, the idea of war crimes is a little bit suspicious. Now, that's not to say, well, so there's two things that we need to separate. On the one hand, if a nation goes to war in self-defense, then whatever measures are necessary to secure victory are justifiable. That's not to say that one should deliberately justify atrocities like rape and torture and because a free country that's defending itself has to have a certain moral belief in its right to defend itself, that it has to believe that it's morally in the right. And committing atrocities against innocent people, I'm not talking here about casualties, because particularly when you have terrorists who are using human shields or whatever, there are going to be casualties. But obviously deliberate cruelty against civilians is off the table. And I think it's not in anybody's interest. It wouldn't be in the interest of a free, civilized country for its own soldiers, its own militaries to be committing actual atrocities even against an aggressor nation.
Kirk, do you agree about the idea of a war crime?
Yeah, and you can take this. Yeah, it's the aggressing country that is inappropriately invading its neighbors. Anything that they do at that point is a crime. And I've seen this rhetoric when talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Like every time they bomb a hospital or an apartment building, people say, "Oh, this is a war crime." It's like everything Russia is doing is a war crime, even if they just limited their destruction to just mowing down uniform Ukrainian soldiers in like a field or something. It's like those Ukrainian soldiers are like, it's not like they're fair game. They're doing what they have to do, and the fact that they are brought into this horrible situation where they have to fight against other soldiers from a neighboring country with guns, like that in of itself is a crime. It's not like that's a fair game, but as soon as Russia strikes like a convenience store or whatever, then that's suddenly a war crime. But on the contrary, if Ukraine were to make strikes inside of Russia or do whatever it takes to bring this war to a swift victory to maintain its sovereignty, yeah, they're entitled to do whatever it takes because their existence is under threat at the moment.
Hmm. So we have a couple of super chats. We have £2 from PC, thank you very much, who says, "Can they define Palestine, its history, its borders?" Well, I suspect no, they can't historically, but this is something that gets kind of argued back and forth a lot. And I think there is kind of a point here, but it's something where people can get into the, oh, this, X people were on the land at this time, so therefore they have the right to it, and so on, which I think is really the wrong way to go about it. And I think also, if you're trying to persuade people of the righteousness of the cause of one side of this or the other, I think it completely shuts people off, because what it almost ends up being is kind of, I think it figures in people's minds as kind of, well, you have to kind of negotiate who had the land deed almost, going back thousands and thousands of years, and how do you even do that? I think people get overwhelmed, immediately, and they get switched off. So, but where I think there is a point, PC, is that when people are talking about kind of the state of Palestine, there certainly is no state of Palestine today. There's a kind of de facto Palestinian state in Gaza ruled by Hamas, but no one seems to really want to claim that as being, the legitimate Palestinian state. And I think when people who are critical of Israel are talking about the creation of Israel in the 40s, they'll sometimes talk about it as kind of having superseded or taken over a Palestinian state. And when people are saying that, then yeah, I think it's right to say that before the creation of Israel in 1947, there was no Palestine. There was all these kind of, imperial administrative regions for thousands of years, and there was no nation state there. So I think that's the context in which it's appropriate to bring it up, because it's not like Israel just annexed the sovereign land of another country. Then we have another one from PC for £5 who said, "Everyone is entitled to a state except the Jews, according to the woke left." I certainly think that's what a lot of their views kind of, amount to. But Nicolas or Kirk, how do you think it figures in their own mind? Because I think if you put it to them that way, I don't think they would agree. For example, if you said to someone who was a critic of Israel that you just don't believe the Jews should have a state, but everyone else should. How do you think it figures in their own mind?
I don't think most people on the woke left even know or care whether there's an Israeli state or not. I mean, they're just so ignorant. But and now there's another point of view that just occurred to me, which it's a bit of a fringe point of view, but I've noticed in recent months a lot of people on the sort of libertarian or anarcho-capitalist end of the spectrum have also tended to side with Palestine, but for a totally different reason, namely that these tend to be people who think that states as such are illegitimate structures. And I suspect that probably Noam Chomsky has expressed some views to this along these lines, that because all states are illegitimate, they see Israel as a sort of an illegitimate occupying force. And so presumably they'd be fine with some degree of Palestinian autonomy or a two-state solution, because it would result in the weakening of this one particular state.
Yes, yeah, you're talking about the kind of the anarcho-capitalist support for Palestine. I always find that really strange. I suspect the reason why you're kind of how you're explaining it from their perspective, I suspect that's right, but it's something that I always find really weird. And the way that the anarchists end up supporting what would typically be thought of as very left-wing positions on foreign policy, that America is the kind of oppressing, awful nation in the world that is perpetrating all these crimes. I always find that really, really strange. And it's something that I would really like to kind of speak to an anarchist about, hypothetically, and just get, were you coming from this kind of perspective originally and then you came to anarchism? Or did you get into anarchism and then you were reading these thinkers and then they convinced you of that, or what exactly motivated you into adopting that position? Because it seems like something they would be more skeptical of, I would think, in than otherwise.
Well, it's really bizarre because I mean, weren't a lot of libertarians on the side of the Viet Cong during
I
the
think so,
Vietnam
yeah.
War? I seem to recall Anka or someone from ARI even did it. Oh, no, it was Nikos who did a podcast on this recently. That even Murray Rothbard was on the anti-American side during the Vietnam War because they hate states so much, they hate the U.S. so much that they'll even take the side of an oppressive regime and individual rights be damned.
Yeah, it's truly bizarre.
And a
Kirk,
lot of libertarians are siding with Russia in their war against Ukraine. If you recall, there was
Yeah.
an anti-war rally a few years ago in Washington, D.C., and they have a lot of demands made at the United States and Ukraine and Zelensky and NATO, but none seemingly aimed at Putin or Russia or whatever. And I think I think even like when they were speaking, there were like Russian flags waving behind them. And then they'll like try to weasel, like, oh, we're not pro-Russia, we're just anti-war. That's how they try to weasel out of that one.
but that again, that just feels so nakedly ridiculous a position to adopt, doesn't it? The idea that you could just be in favor of Putin or whoever because you're against state power when when Putin himself is really just a dictator. Um, yeah, I find it hard to get in like inside their heads and see it from their perspective of how they rationalize it. But that's just truly bizarre. Um, what was the initial super chat we were talking about? Oh yeah, so Kirk, I was wanted to say, do you think people on the left, because again, how from their perspective do they rationalize the idea of opposing an Israeli state? Because again, I think if you put it, although I think PC is kind of right that they support self-determination for all peoples, except when it comes to the Jews, they have a real problem with that. How do you think they think about it from their perspective? Is it just kind of, well, we tried the Israeli state, but they just turned out to be these awful oppressors who want to oppress their neighbors, and they're reenacting the Holocaust is something they'll typically say. Do you think it's something like that, or how do you think they think about it?
I mean, it's pretty complicated to answer, but then at the same time, I'm like, don't ask me to make sense of the craziness from the left. But yeah, from what I can tell, it's what Elon Journal calls what is it? The underdog premise that like, the people in Gaza, they're poor and they're suffering, Israel rich and successful, so therefore Israel must be the bad guy. I imagine that's like how they think of it. And when it comes to like solutions or whatever, I don't know if they're maybe at a deep level, they're not really that interested, other than they just think Israel bad and they'll justify or support whatever destruction comes their way.
Mm,
Yeah, I agree with Kirk. I think hatred of the West, hatred of Enlightenment values, hatred of industrialization is a lot of what's motivating these people. It's not surprising that a lot of the pro-Palestinian protesters, they're the same sort of people who would protest in favor of environmentalist restrictions, protesting climate change. It's the same sort of mentality. It's the anti-civilization, anti-industrial mentality. And because Israel is a successful, prosperous, relatively Western state. Any other state in the Middle East, they're fine. Doesn't matter if they oppress women like Iran, if they oppress minorities, but a successful, relatively free market state, no, that's just anathema to many of these people.
mm. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you could find a kind of academic essay somewhere that would be explaining how the creation of a Palestinian state would actually really help save the environment. I suspect they could probably find a way to make that kind of integration. But okay, guys, I think we've probably spoken about that long enough. And our other two topics we'll just save for another day because we won't really be able to address them in 10 minutes. And we also have a super chat from Jonathan for $1. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
But thank you very much for joining us, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. We'll see you all then. Bye bye.